Trouble Boys. You heard a little Big Star before that with Feel from #1 record, God Save the Queen, and Halloween, Alaska, All the Arms Around You. With me is a friend, an incredible writer, straight from Memphis, my friend Bob Mehr. How are you, Bob?
I'm good, man. Thank you for having me.
So that's kind of like your walk-up music if you were a ball player.
Right.
Little Dave Edmunds.
Little Dave Edmunds. Well, the title of the book, too. The title track, as it were.
The title of the book, okay, Trouble Boys, the true story of the Replacements. And Bob is in town because the book came out on Tuesday, and he's going to be at the Turf Club on Saturday and doing a book reading and signing and other hijinks possibly up your sleeve for that.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff is on the table.
Okay, so let's just, I want to get the listeners familiar with you. So, where were you born?
I was actually born overseas. I was born in Iran, but my family had been living here, just happened to go back for the period that I was born, and I grew up mostly in Los Angeles, and then about high school age moved to Arizona, and then have since bounced around. Started working at newspapers, basically as a music critic since I was about 22, 23. Phoenix, Seattle, Chicago, and for the last 10 years I've been working as the music critic at the daily paper in Memphis.
And so with all of those cities that you have bounced around in, the formative teenage years, were they spent in Arizona?
Kind of. I literally left in the middle of my 8th grade year, so I sort of, straddle a little bit of being, California still feels like home,
yeah,
but Arizona is where, I kind of grew up, so.
Okay, so as we were all teenagers and desperately seeking an identity through rock bands, what was coming onto your radar the strongest, let's say, the high school years?
High school years, it was interesting because growing up in California right before we moved, I was listening to a lot of oldies radio, and it was sort of this weird existence of almost being like in the 50s, because there was a really powerhouse AM station, KRLA, and at the time in the mid-80s, they kind of revived all these old DJs. So like Wolfman Jack would be on there, The Real Don Steele. So I literally, as a little kid, would call Wolfman Jack and request songs.
Yes.
So I had this kind of weird time warp experience. And then by the time we moved to Arizona, I started kind of doing the thing that I think a lot of people do. You hear about the Eagles, and then you're like, well, I don't know like all their stuff, but I like the early stuff. And then, well, what other bands were these guys in? Like, my entry into the whole world of Graham Parsons and the Flying Burrito Brothers came because of Bernie Leadon. So I did a lot of that, both with country music and with rock and roll and blues, the whole thing, starting with the Rolling Stones and working back to Howlin' Wolf. So there was a lot of that going on. And then all the alternative stuff that was happening really through the 80s, late 80s and early 90s, and obviously the Replacements being one of those bands.
And when was, if you recall, what is the first memory you have of them coming across your radar?
Well, I like to say that I saw them before I ever heard them, because I just by happenstance happened to see the Saturday Night Live episode in January '86. I was about 11, 12 years old at the time, and I was probably watching it because Anthony Michael Hall was on there, and I liked Weird Science or something. But and I really didn't know the band at that point, but that certainly made an impression on me, just the fact that they were the kind of disregard they had for the stage and for the moment. And at that time, maybe in the 70s, there was more live rock and roll, but at that point, there was a lot of lip sync stuff. So seeing the Replacements on Saturday Night Live and the way they performed, and even kind of the volume and just how ragged it was, it felt so different than anything you'd see on like Solid Gold.
Sure, sure. Andy Gibb is not going to be introing. It's Harry Dean Stanton, who's also drunk. But I think it's interesting because, of course, that is a fairly pivotal part in their story that you get into some depth in the book. Their appearance on Saturday Night Live, which was sort of an arduous process to even get them on the show, and then once they got on, I feel like, am I giving away spoilers?
Right.
It's like, do people know what happened? So, and it's funny because I think it was a link that came up from a review of your book, and it was G.E. Smith, and he was talking about the two most memorable musical events, which seems hard to believe, but he pulled out the Replacements appearance and a Roxy Music appearance. Did you see that?
Yeah,
clip?
I did see that, and that was actually, I think, something taped for the Museum of Television and Radio very recently. And I read about the Saturday Night Live chapter as a pivotal kind of thing. Actually, Rolling Stone excerpted that portion online a couple weeks ago. So yeah, that's it's certainly a flashpoint moment in their career, and It resulted in them not being on TV for several years, but it's become a little bit of a legend and a myth story among many myths about the band. So I tried to get a little bit behind what was going on, not just with the band, but what was going on with Saturday Night Live as a show at that point.
Right.
So all that's kind of in the book.
Well, so when you started thinking, I think this is a story that needs telling in some fashion that is thorough, and it sounds to me like from everybody's reaction is that you were really conscientious to cover a lot of the Stinson family history, and to really sort of unearth a little bit more about Bob Stinson, who I think and many times has been regarded as just this sort of musical savant goof guy, and there's so much more to it, and I think you did a fine job of really getting down to some of the dynamics within the family, within his childhood and growing up, and I do think that's going to be surprising to some people.
Yeah, and it turned out it was so central to the way the group started, and really in a way what they always were. I mean, it's the kind of guiding spirit in a sense, the trouble he went through and how he reconnected to the world through music, and sort of had a drive to both save himself and his brother with this band, and it was one of the few opportunities I guess he saw, and then obviously linking up with Paul Westerberg and the way the sort of band went from there. So it is like, for me, I always looked at it as a thing of, there was a story about the replacements, they'd been written about to death, but it was always felt like a surface story. It wasn't the thing of like, it was always they did this, they did that wild thing, but what I was always left with was the question why. What was behind it? What were they actually thinking? What was the real motivation? And I felt like nothing that had been out there up to this, the point that I started, really answered that. And part of that is because the band themselves were very guarded about opening up and even looking back, and for their own purposes, looking back and reflecting on what their career had been. So I think in a sense, one of the things I wanted to do, and the only way I wanted to do it, was if the band was going to be involved, certainly Paul and Tommy, and many of the key principals, Peter Jesperson, their longtime manager. So for me, it was like, I wanted to tell the story from the inside out rather than the outside in, which is kind of the way it's been told up till now.
And obviously, timing has so much to do with everything. Do you think you could have written this book, or even approached writing this book, say 10 years prior to when you started?
No, I mean, the question has come up, it's like, why did they let you do this? And I like to think it's just good looks and charm.
Well, there's that.
But really, it was just dumb luck and timing in a sense. If I'd approached it even a couple years before I did, enough time had passed since the group had broken up in '91, and since Bob had passed in '95. And I think both Paul and Tommy were at points in their lives where you get to a certain age, you get to a certain point where you're able to be more reflective. You're able to kind of look back. And I think for both of them, it's always been a difficult thing. It kind of, the legacy and the shadow of the replacements is kind of cast across everything they've done since then. And I think, in the 20 or so years that they weren't performing and weren't an entity, this thing grew up around them. And so at some point they were going to have to grapple with what this legacy was and what it was they created. And I just happened to be the guy at that moment that said, hey, how about we do this? And fortunately, they agreed.
For, a bunch of working class everyday clowns, there's a certain element of a bit larger than life-ness to some of their characters. And before you met any of them, were you thinking, oh my God, I'm going in to interview G.G. Allen? Or was it like,
No, it's funny. I had just in kind of the role as a working journalist, had interviewed Paul and Tommy and knew Peter, and had experiences with him, mostly on the phone. And then the first time I came out and interviewed Paul face-to-face was about 2004. And it was an interesting point because I think he was really at that point, he lost his father recently, his son was growing up. He was at a point where I think you just naturally get to, where you're like, let me look back, what is the cycles of life and all that sort of stuff. I think it just puts you in that mood. And so we connected that day. It would be several years before we'd actually get the book started. But my first interaction with him was one where he was in a really open place. And I think everything we did since then, just it kind of followed suit from there.
Did you meet in public, or did you?
The first time we met in public at a coffee place. And it was funny. It was around the time of the 2004 elections. And we were sitting outside, I think at Dunn Brothers Coffee or something. And these kids who were canvassing for Kerry were sitting next to us, kind of overhearing the conversation with their ear, out listening, but not didn't know who it was. And then at the end of it, they were like, oh, who are you? And I think he explained to them he was a very famous children's author or something. But he came off as very much, I guess you get that sense that could be a terrifying experience. But both of them, in their own way. I mean, Tommy almost has much more of a kind of star quality and magnetism in terms of that, because he's been in Guns N' Roses, and that's the kind of world he's been living in. With Paul, I found somebody who, a kind of suburban dad, so to speak.
Yeah, he is a joke. Let's get some. I was asking you a little earlier, and of course, when you ask a Replacements fan, oh God, there's so much I want to ask you. I mean, I guess from my perspective, and living in Minneapolis, this band has they possess a certain amount of power, and there's a certain amount of people sort of have a little bit of an ownership feeling towards this band. And I don't know if that's just true for any city's sort of hometown band, but there is a certain amount of, I saw them when, I was the first to do this. And it's interesting because when you're writing a book with facts and things that are in order, it's going to be interesting for people how many yahoos are going to come out and go, yeah, I was at that and it didn't go down like that. But, you were thorough in all the players, if you will, in this play, that you got their perspectives. Did it all match up, or were there one or two that you went, oh my God?
Well, the funny thing about bands and the life of a band is a lot of it tends to blur in a weird way, because it's a repeating pattern of shows and records and touring and venues and vans and that kind of stuff. And, you add alcohol and whatever else into the mix, it adds a whole layer of haze. So, yeah, there were always incidents or moments where people were maybe recalling things somewhat differently. So my job was to talk to as many people who were there and present and kind of come up with some subjective truth, as close to what happened. There is no such thing as a kind of objective truth when you're dealing with memory, because it gets filtered and changed. But for the most part, and that's why, I took a lot of stick for the book taking as long as it did. I thought it'd take 2 years. Yeah. It ended up taking closer to 7. Yeah. But part of it was unraveling all that stuff and being as certain as possible that, about specific incidents or episodes. And that's never an easy thing, and it was probably more difficult than for most bands with this one.
All right, current listeners, we're taking you to the CC Club. Bob Mehr is standing in front of the jukebox, and he's looking at the selections off Hootenanny. Which one might you choose?
I suppose I would choose Heyday.
All right. We'll be back with Bob Mehr here on The Current.